Hi everyone, Misleading here with Rhyme Signatures, the nerdiest music review this side of having a comedy name in a deeply traumatic and otherwise emotionally damaging story. And today, as the first video of 2023, we are going to be doing a ranking of the studio albums by The Deer Hunter. Now, I've been meaning to do a video like this for a little while now, but honestly, I've just had that much other stuff going on, be it real life, other videos, or just good old-fashioned apathy-induced laziness, yeah. But we're here now, and I want to rank the studio albums of one of my all-time favourite bands, The Deer Hunter. This has been a reasonably tricky list to compile, as this is one of the few bands that I feel doesn't have any genuinely bad releases, merely ones that aren't as good as others. But after careful deliberation, I've come to what I feel to be my own personal, definitive ranking of all the studio albums. Now, obviously, there's a few ground rules I want to lay out. We will not be including anything from the colour spectrum, as that is most assuredly a collection of EPs, and this is about the studio LPs. Ditto to the Indigo Child, and all is as all should be. And we shall also not be taking into consideration the orchestral reimagining album of The Fox and the Hunt. Live albums are also not in consideration here. This is purely looking at the major studio records that have been released under the banner of The Deer Hunter, so there will also be no side project stuff or solo work. With all of that out of the way, let's start at the bottom and work our way up. Okay, so everyone starts somewhere, and in some instances a band's debut is their most scintillating, exciting piece, showcasing perfectly what their sound is, nailing the execution of their ideology perfectly, and crafting an impregnable fortress of unbeatable excellence with their very first swing. Sadly, not every band can be King Crimson in that regard, and The Deer Hunter is no exception to this rule. While Act 1 is undeniably one of the most important releases in the band's catalogue, it very much feels like a proof of concept, really, rather than a fully baked and realised product. Now, it's not to say that this is a bad record. As I've previously mentioned, I don't believe that The Deer Hunter have released a single dud. It's just that this release is so dramatically overshadowed by its subsequent output that this is often all too easy to overlook. It's a much safer album, lacking much in the way of the progressive tendencies of the band's catalogue, and sticking to a much more muted indie rock template, with only a few glimmers of what was to emerge from the band as they continued the adventure into the blossoming narrative of the remaining Act albums. There's still a lot to love on this album, though. There's a rawness, a hunger to it all. Casey sounds like a man with a lot to prove, and as such there's a sense of liberty and passion to his vocals, raspier and more anguished in places than the band would become later on. It's a reasonably brief record too, clocking in at just shy of 40 minutes, which would become uncharacteristically short for them as time went on. Act 1 is a perfectly competent record that I do still come back to, but really, it's mostly as a means to remind myself of where the subsequent leitmotifs and later records came from, to give them a greater sense of weight and gravitas. Still worth a listen, but it's not an ideal place to come into the band. With elegance, you clean and captivate. I will confess this is easily my least listened to album by The Deer Hunter, and I feel will be the one I have the least to say about. Is it bad? Again, no, we've discussed this already. Casey doesn't make bad albums. Migrant is more of a curious beast, feeling somewhat anachronistic and disjointed within the grand scope of the band's style and overall footprint. In the long gap between Act 3 and 4, the band fired out the spectacular series of EPs known as the Colour Spectrum, and this odd little thing. Migrant stands alone insofar that it is the only studio album released by the band that is not part of a greater narrative or ongoing sequence of records. Now, while this is undoubtedly for some to be a strength to the album, for me it represents its greatest weakness. The Deer Hunter are, for me, a band at their best when they explore the narrative structure between their records, sprinkling in trivia, leitmotifs, callbacks, and other such energising musical nuggets throughout. This particular record lacks any of that really, sitting in as a perfectly acceptable, mostly piano-driven indie rock album. And there's nothing on here that's objectively poor or uninteresting. It is, after all, a testament to Casey and the band's abilities that this is still a better and more interesting indie rock album than the vast majority of their peers are capable of creating. But this definitely lacks the spark of imagination and drive that the rest of the band's discography demonstrates. I positioned this one higher than Act 1 as, frankly, it's beautifully produced, the vocals are fantastic, and there's some really catchy hooks to be found throughout. And it just feels like a more complete package when taken on its own merits than Act 1 does. But the lack of connection to anything grander than itself does hold Migrant back from this being any higher on this list. Here we are, the newest blood on the list. Antimai is the freshest release from the band at the time of recording, at least, until the tentatively titled follow-up Sonia arrives later this year. Theoretically, possibly, potentially, who knows? Antimai is, in a lot of ways, very similar to Act 1, but with the confidence and experience of band who've been doing this for a much longer time now. I feel this is comparable to Act 1 insofar that it is the foundational element of a story on waiting to unfold itself before us. And while I enjoy an origin story as much as the next person, I've always been more of a fan of the second and third books to a trilogy. Two Towers and Return of the King are better for me, for example, than Fellowship. But that being said, there's something very exciting about Antimai, something very fresh and interesting. The Act series of albums have always been the mainstay of the Deer Hunters' output for most of the life of the band, and as such I have become very attached to them and very fond of the overall arcing narrative and characters therein. To have something like Antimai come along, which is a shake-up not only from a storytelling perspective, but from a musical one as well, have kept this origin story feeling remarkably interesting. Now, I've already spoken at length about this record in my top 15 albums of 2022 video and its individual album review, but I ranked this at a pretty hefty 6th place in my top 15, and it remains an excellent addition to the band's remarkable discography. In truth, this album may very well end up ranking higher if I'm to revisit the band's back catalogue in years to come, so the subsequent entries into the Indigo Child saga make more relevance of the prose within Antimai. But alas, I cannot hold off on forever on doing a ranking video, and as such, at number 5 this shall remain for now. Mostly as the remaining records on this list are so strong that this would need a considerably longer brewing time before the true depths of its flavours can really be appreciated.
Wheels lusting for the lives of infantry. His turrets turning from accountability.
I've often viewed the Deer Hunter under two different lenses. There's the indie rock, the guitar-driven melodic albums where traditional structures such as the verse-chorus routine is the order of the day, and then there's the stage musical side of things where the band embraces the glitz, the theatre, the pomp and bravado of the stage. Act 3, for me at least, feels like it is the bridging album between these two elements of the band, and is consequently one of the easier albums to recommend to people new to the Deer Hunter. Now, this may not be where I made my entry, more on that later, but Act 3 is definitely where the Deer Hunter had started to become more comfortable than just being a traditional band, and lent more heavily into the mythos, the storytelling, and theatricality that would come to define their later years. There's a lot of the DNA of the earlier parts of their work, though. Casey's vocals are still quite raw and anguished in certain places, with a degree of throatiness to the delivery. But we're also treated to the first true demonstration of how broad his range is, with some incredible falsettos, layered harmonies, as well as the aggression and throatiness that became archetypal of their early days. Act 3 is where I start to be able to name certain songs as amongst my favourite in the discography. Classics like The Tank with its sinister waltz-like instrumentation, Saved with its plaintive, heartfelt and evocative vocals, and He Said He Had a Story for all its distressing character development and lyrical intrigue. There's so many parts of this record that stick with me long after the final moments of life and death play the album out. Act 3 is an excellent demonstration of how to craft a deep, nuanced concept album but doesn't leave the accessibility at home. So much of this album is easy to enjoy at face value, but it's what lies beneath the surface that makes it so memorable. step up from Act 1 to Act 2 was, and frankly still is, utterly jaw-dropping to me. From this 40-minute long indie rock album to a mammoth-sized 77-minute long rock opera, Act 2 was the magician pulling back the curtain after the opening trick to reveal that there was so much more to it all. The grand plan was unveiled, and to this day the scope and ambition of this record is simply staggering. Listening back to this record after digesting all of the other acts is a wonderful treat, as you'll find yourself wide-eyed as you realise just where all those riffs, melodies and vocal patterns came from to begin with, where it all began, and just how impactful a full understanding of this record makes everything else. The breadth of creativity on Act 2 is nothing short of remarkable. It is at times hard to believe that this came from the same band who made Act 1, but regardless, the footprint is there. The DNA is coursing through the backbone of Act 2. The elements that made the band so intriguing early on have been fully capitalised on and turned up to the proverbial 11. This record is huge. Nothing is minimised or truncated. This is an entirely maximalist album in every sense of the word. There's the theatricality and musicianship of tracks like The Lake and the River, the narrative-rich record-spanning first 3 parts of the 6th part, The Bittersweet, which honestly could be an album into itself with just how many styles, genres, moods and feelings it covers. Smiling Swine fires up the melody machine with a toe-tapping groove. Blood of the Rose oozes an intimate and passionate ballroom dance energy. Red Hands is evocative of some of the most sensual, heartbreaking and personal lyrics within the narrative. There really is so much going on with this record that it's incredibly hard to call out the best moments, as it's just one long, uninterrupted stream of some of the finest music I've ever heard. One of the biggest compliments I can give an album is that the runtime is barely noticed, and while this weighs in at a hefty 77 minutes long, I barely feel the length at all, and I keep finding myself repeating this one over and over, longing to find new musical nuggets, lyrical through lines to later albums, more nuance to the story, and just enjoying every single second of a band showing off the fact that their first record really was just a test of the waters. And this is what they are truly capable of. Act 2 was absolutely captivating, and it is only the fact that the next 2 albums were where I started with this band that keeps this one from ranking higher. Okay, here we go. So far, this is the final album in the Act series. Act 5 is of a scope I had hitherto not really thought possible with music. This record stands aside from 90% of other bands out there to be a near-perfect marriage of progressive rock, classical music, swing, indie rock, storytelling, and pure inventive poetry. This, coupled with the number 1 spot, which I'm sure the more astute of you will have figured out by now through process of elimination, represent the absolute finest not only of the Deer Hunters' work, but of, frankly, most modern music in general. You know, when I tell people that I'm a fan of this band, what I'm really saying is that I'm a helpless squealing fanboy for every single second of these last 2 albums. They live rent-free in my head, and I'm never filing for an eviction on these. So, why is Act 5 at number 2 and not number 1 of this list? Honestly, between this and The Champion, there's incredibly little to pick from. They're both massive, sprawling, creative and sumptuous epics, each breaching the 70-minute mark and earning every single second of that runtime. But I feel that Act 5 sits in the penultimate place purely because I feel that the overall mood of the top spot is more appealing to me. That's it, really. Act 5 feels like a more introspective, contemplative piece, and it is perhaps to its detriment that it is also currently the last of the Act albums we will see for a while. Act 6 is allegedly coming out at some point, but only Casey knows when that is, and Lord knows I'd rather he take his time than force it out before it's ready. But for now we must assume that this is the end, as it were. But it feels like there's a piece missing by the time this ends, like there must be more to what we've just had. And it is this feeling of longing, this need for a continuation, that puts Act 5 second fiddle to my favourite Deer Hunter album. If this represented a more complete and definitive conclusion to the narrative arc, it is likely that this would be what I consider to be the best of the Deer Hunters' work. As it is, though, we've only got some of the most interesting creativity on board here. with the swing-inspired Mr. Usher on his way to town, the morose The Haves Have Naught, the passionate and debonair two-hit combo of The Fire and the March, amongst many other erstwhile classics. Act 5 is a massive, fascinating toy box of constant delight. Every new song showcasing a new excitement, a new flair, a new demonstration of just how bold and inventive this band truly is. I do feel this is honestly a great jumping in point for the band, but it's still not quite as good of one as the record that got me into the Deer Hunter. Yeah, you probably sussed this out a few entries ago. This is going to be my top spot. And honestly, how could it not? Much like myself, it's a wild, flamboyant, camp, glorious celebration of musical theatre and vaudeville, all wrapped around a core of solid, dependable, modern progressive rock, with some of the best storytelling, most intriguing lyrical concepts, and the most fearless songwriting from the band to date. Act 4 is a titan of the genre, a record that stands head and shoulders above virtually everything else to have come out since the early 2000s, and honestly, it's my personal pick for the best album of the 2010s. That's a video I may or may not eventually do, but spoilers, you kind of already know the number one spot for it, even if I did make that video. So, what is it about this record? Honestly, I feel a really personal connection to this one. It's the album I discovered the band with, and it showed me a whole new world of sound I didn't know I needed at the time. I feel it kind of unlocked a core memory within me. I fell in love with the world, the narrative, the instrumentation, and just the sound of Casey's voice. Everything felt so overwhelming, but yet so comfortable and safe at the same time. This album literally inspired me to start playing the bass. It was this record. I drove my poor housemates insane with the amount of time I spent playing along to the Bittersweet 4 and 5, but goddamn, it felt so good to jam out to that song. I was playing along to music that moved me in ways others just couldn't manage. The scope and depth of the emotions on Act 4 are just beyond compare. There is so much going on throughout the overall runtime. The heart-wrenching waves, the intense and dramatic A Night on the Town, the up-tempo and infectious energy of The Squeaky Wheel and King of Swords Reversed, the sinister and brooding weight. I cannot overstate just how much of this album has formed the groundwork for my musical taste since it was released. And that's ultimately why I feel this is my favourite Deer Hunter release. I think it kind of unlocked new potential within me. It showed me an incredible world of musicality that I just didn't know about beforehand. Now, every subsequent release I've heard has never quite had that same initial impact that Act 4 did. I mean, obviously this was always going to be the case, as you can only have a first impression once after all. But the first impression that I had with this album was so utterly overwhelming, so affecting and so long-lasting, that to consider this anything less than the finest album by the Deer Hunter would be a complete lie to myself. So, there we have it. That is my ranking for the Deer Hunter's studio albums circa January 2023. Now, I'd love to hear about how this stacks up against your own personal listing, so let me know which your favourite is in the comments down there. This, obviously, as you should well know, is just a ranking, it's just an opinion, just what I think about it. So tell me what you thought of the Deer Hunter's discography. Which is your least favourite, your favourite, the mid-tier, everything. Just let me know about it. If you did like this video, please do consider sharing it around with anyone else who you think might enjoy it. Please, of course, consider subscribing for some more content. And if you really, really do love me and love what I do, do consider maybe clicking my Ko-fi link in the description down below. Until next time, guys. Happy 2023, and keep your rhyme signatures odd.